Yes, thank you all so much for having me today. I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you this Breast Cancer Awareness Month about Breast Cancer UK and also to talk to you about breast cancer prevention, which is what we're all about. We is Breast Cancer UK, so very quick background, we are a UK-based charity, so we cover all of the UK, but, and I won't be able to go into this today, but we do have a relationship with the EU when it comes to regulations, which I'll touch on a little bit later on in my talk. So we're UK-based, and we were founded about 21 years ago by some breast cancer survivors, and they had a common concern, and their main concern is that they were very concerned that there's not enough awareness around the causes of breast cancer, not enough awareness around how we can address the risks of breast cancer, and importantly, not enough investment in scientific research into understanding the causes of breast cancer and how we can prevent it. So they felt, let's get together, let's encourage the scientific community to start to invest more in scientific research, let's raise awareness, let people know that actually breast cancers can be prevented, and importantly, let's influence policy and politicians to make sure that they start to put effective prevention policies in place and address this really, really important issue. And why is it so important? Well, the stats speak for themselves. So if you look at this graph, this is a WHO graph looking at the incidence rates for breast cancer in 2020. The pink wedge is breast cancer. What it tells us is that breast cancer is the most diagnosed cancer in the world. It's the most prevalent cancer in women, and it's the most diagnosed cancer in the world. It's also the most prevalent cancer in France, in Western Europe, and the most prevalent cancer in women. What's really interesting about breast cancer is that it's much more prevalent in wealthier regions such as Australasia, Western Europe, UK, America, than in poorer regions such as South Asia and most of Africa. In fact, breast cancer rates are 4 times higher in wealthier regions than in the poorer regions. And there are reasons for that we don't fully understand, but we suspect that we understand. And it's very important for us to understand that in order to be able to do something about it. So these are the figures for the UK, but actually they're very similar to what we see in Western Europe and very much in France as well. So this tells us 2 stories. We've got the graph, the line on top that shows the incidence rates, and the line down the bottom which is the mortality rates. What we see is that the incidence rates since records began have consistently gone up in the UK at quite an alarming rate. On the plus side, the mortality rate has dropped by a whopping 35% since the early 70s. And that's fantastic news because that's all down to advances in scientific research, in treatment, in care. But in the UK, we still have about 11,000 women dying every year. In France, it's about 12,000 women. So way too many deaths. It's great that mortality rates have gone down, but we're not addressing the elephant in the room, and that's the rates that are increasing. And that pretty much explains what we're all about. Just to give you context around what that means in terms of diagnosis. In Europe, about just over 355,000 women every year receive a diagnosis. A terrible, devastating diagnosis. 56,000 in the UK, and in France, alarmingly, it's just edging ahead of the UK. And what's interesting about France and the UK is that in the UK we've seen the rates double in the past 50 years, which is alarming in itself. But in France they've doubled since 1990. So we've seen that France was kind of lagging behind the UK in incidence rates, but we've seen a sharp increase, and now they've caught up with the UK. So what this means for our lifetime risk is that that's also gone up. So if we, in 1996, a woman would expect to have a lifetime risk of 1 in 12 of ever developing the disease, so that means across her life. And now if we were born after 1960, it's 1 in 7. So the 2 things we're seeing is, number 1, incidence rates have doubled, they just keep going up. And number 2, our likelihood of developing breast cancer has also gone up. And these are things that are happening despite the fact that we know that at least 30% of breast cancers can be prevented. at least 30% of breast cancers could be prevented through effective prevention action. And that's really not something that we can ignore, and it's pretty much our raison d'être. That's why we're here. Before I explain what we do, what we do understand about breast cancer is breast cancer prevention is there's lots of interventions that we can do, but there's a lot more research that needs to happen. So what are we doing about it? Well, the first thing, as I mentioned to some of you earlier on, is that we're entirely dedicated to the primary prevention of breast cancer. So what that means is anything that we can do before a diagnosis actually happens. We want to see a diversion of those dreadful diagnoses. We know that at least 17,000 women in the UK could avoid a diagnosis every year if we were putting in place effective prevention. So the first thing we need to do is to understand the causes. I mentioned earlier on that there's not an awful lot of research happening in prevention. So we are dedicated to supporting, encouraging the scientific community to do more research. And we do that by raising funds and funding animal-free scientific research. Sorry? Animal-free. So we don't fund research that use animals, and there's a very good reason for that. But I won't have time to go into that, but I'll be happy to explain that to you a bit later. The other thing we do is we raise awareness, so we have tools, digital tools that are available to the general public. So even if you're not in the UK, go to our website and you'll find a whole suite of education tools, interactive tools. The best way to start your journey is to do our quiz, and I'm going to show you a QR code for that. And that quiz is really designed to help individuals look at their own lifestyle, look at their own personal situation, answer a few questions, and then we produce for you a purpose-made prevention plan. And then if you sign up for it, then we will follow up and give you support around how you can reduce your risk. So we do education. We're also going to launch next year a big outreach program where, you know, I go out and talk to people, but I can't go out and talk to everyone. So we're actually going to have a big program we're going to develop to get educators out across the country to start to educate people. Because one thing that we've realised is that the majority of people don't know that breast cancer can be prevented. They don't understand what prevention means. I'm not going to have time to talk to you about this, but early detection is about, you know, breast checking, and that's really important, but that's not prevention. Prevention is everything we do before a cancer develops. And then finally, the other thing that we do that's really important is we lobby government to understand the importance of prevention. It's very low on their agenda, and for good reason. It's very hard to measure prevention, it's very hard to sell prevention, so that's part of the work that we do. And we also look at regulations around chemicals, because we're very concerned about the impact that chemicals can have as well. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. I know I need to rush through this. I'm trying to do a condensed version here. I know most of you probably know what cancer is, but I thought I'd just touch on what it is, what breast cancer is. So it's like any other cancer. It's when cells divide or grow in an uncontrolled way. That's basically what cancer is, and breast cancer is exactly the same. What's important for cancer to develop is the more a cell divides, the more likely it is to mutate, and then for that mutation to go on to become cancer. So anything that can influence cell division or cause cells to divide more often can also increase the risk of cancer happening, and that's also the case with breast cancer. So in breast cancer's case, sex hormones play a really, really important part, and by that we mean estrogen and progesterone. So when we talk about estrogen, we think about, okay, women have high levels of estrogen circulating in their body, and that has a huge impact on breast cancer. But when women reach the menopause, the only place that estrogen is found actually is in fat cells. So, which is quite interesting, because in actual fact, once we've hit the menopause, we've got about the same amount of estrogen in our body as men do. But before the menopause, we've got much higher levels of circulating hormones, in particular estrogen. And the thing about estrogen is that it can increase how often our cells divide. And that is what makes it a link to the risk of breast cancer. So essentially, lifetime exposure, which we get generally as women, to high concentrations of estrogen is what increases our breast cancer risk. So I've mentioned women, and yes, breast cancer primarily affects women, we're aware of that. And so that's called a risk factor that we can't change. But there is another risk factor, and that's aging. So being a woman and aging are the two main risk factors for breast cancer, and there's nothing we can do about it. Quite simply, aging increases our risk of most cancers. But in the case of breast cancer, being a woman and aging are the two main risk factors. Now, when I talk about aging, in the UK it's about the same in France. About 83% of breast cancers that are diagnosed happen in women over the age of 50. So you can see how there's a relationship between being a female, high levels of estrogen, and aging, which increases our risk. And the other thing about being a woman is that we have more breast, which can potentially become cancerous. So those are the reasons why women are more likely to develop breast cancer, but men can get breast cancer too. And it's a bit more complex as to why men get breast cancer, but they can get breast cancer. It's much, much rarer. So we don't kind of want men to start panicking going, oh, but what's important for men to know is that it can happen. So in the UK, there's about 400 cases every year. In France, it's about 500 cases. We're seeing some worrying trends in France, I have to say. And the important thing for men to know, actually, is not so much that they're at higher risk, although the cases have increased over the past 50 years in men as well. We've just developed a brand new campaign, which we've just launched this Breast Cancer Awareness Month, directed at men. And it's probably, well, I don't think it's probably, the best resources you'll find on breast cancer in men. So we've got loads of great resources. We've got Check Your Pecs resources. So, you know, we don't refer to men's breasts as breasts. We've asked men how they want to be, what they want to call them, and they prefer calling them pecs. We've got personal stories and lots of targeted information at men. The reason it's really important is because typically men are less aware that they can get breast cancer. Typically they ignore the signs, and when they do get diagnosed, it's often a little bit too late, and so the outcomes will often be poorer in men. And one thing that I'm not going to be able to talk too much about, but really important, is early detection in breast cancer is key for men and for women. And if we detect the signs of breast cancer early, we've got a very high chance of making a full recovery. And that's really important to know. So we don't put off checking our breasts or having any concerns. If we do have any concerns, we're going to talk to our GP. So what are the causes, and why have incidence rates gone up so much in the past 50, and in France's case 30 years? And the answer is, it's not simple. We don't really know. We know that there are risk factors that we can't change. There are risk factors that we can change. This is what the big elephant in the room is. And there's also protective factors. And it's how all of those interact with each other that will determine whether or not we go on to develop breast cancer. But we believe that all of those risk factors that we still don't know enough about, that we still haven't invested enough in scientific research to understand, they have kind of hidden in them the answers to why the incidence rates have gone up so much. So there are risk factors I mentioned we can't change. I'm not going to talk about those. I'm happy to later if you want me to. So being a woman, aging, family history is really important as well. The family history makes up about 30% of breast cancers. And there are some other risk factors as well that we can't change. I'm not going to talk to you about that today. I'm going to talk about those that we can change because they're very important for us to know about, and they also have an impact on other disease. We've got 5 minutes left. Okay, very quickly. Okay, the things, I'm going to rush through this. I can give you detail at the table if you want. These things all increase our risk of breast cancer. Drinking, unfortunately. There are links to alcohol. About 8% of breast cancers are attributed to alcohol. Basically, stick to the alcohol guidelines. It's safest not to drink. I know that's not the message you want to hear. The pill, HRT, that increases our estrogen levels, so that increases risk. If you want more information about that, we have lots on our website. There's good reason for taking these, so we're not saying don't take them. And remember, it's a range of risk factors and how they interplay that matters. Living in a city, unfortunately, pollution, we know, can be carcinogenic. That also increases risk of smoking, particularly in premenopausal women. And also light at night, and we think that people who work at night, for example, may have reduced levels of melatonin. Melatonin controls the circadian rhythm, and the melatonin is anti-estrogenic. So if we have lower levels, we think there might be a link there as well with breast cancer. Protective factors. Very important thing is maintaining a healthy weight. We know that's great for general health, but actually, particularly for women postmenopausal, I mentioned earlier on, the only place that estrogen is found in a postmenopausal woman is in fat tissue. So if we are overweight or obese and postmenopausal, that significantly increases our risk of breast cancer. Things that can protect us are having a diet that's like a Mediterranean diet, full of colourful fruit and vegetables, because they contain carotenoids and they contain fibre, and they're all protective. Then having children early, so before the age of 30 if you're going to have children. Having lots of children, I think in the north they do quite well, and also breastfeeding. That's something they don't do very well in France. So breastfeeding, having children early and having lots of them is protective. But it's not very popular, is it? So I'm doing a shameless plug here. If you want to see some brilliant recipes that we've created, especially with cancer protecting properties, you can download it for free. There's the QR code if you want to find out more about it, I'll share with you. Something else I have to share with you is exercise. If exercise were a pill, it would be the most cost-effective medicine ever invented. And that's because not only does it help reduce, or it keeps us healthy, it helps reduce things like cardiovascular disease, it helps reduce things like diabetes, but it helps prevent breast cancer. It helps prevent breast cancer by about 20% regular physical activity. It also helps prevent recurrence if we've had a diagnosis, and it drastically reduces the risk of mortality after a diagnosis as well. It really is a magical pill. And any form of physical activity matters. So carrying your laundry up the stairs, picking up your shopping and walking home with it. It doesn't have to be structured exercise, it just needs to be regular movement. And that is really important. Now I wanted to talk to you about EDCs, I'm probably going to run out of time. But EDCs is really important for you to know about. It's an area that we invest our scientific research in. I don't know if you've heard of EDCs. No. Endocrine disrupting chemicals. You'll see here, that's our body, our hormone system, and these chemicals potentially interfere with our hormone system. Why are we worried about it? Because they can interfere with the hormone system that affects breast cancer. So they can increase the levels of estrogen that are circulating in our bodies. They can mimic not just estrogen, but a range of other hormones. So actually there can be lots of other health effects. We're particularly concerned about the effect on breast cancer. And endocrine disrupting chemicals are now all over the world. We find them in our natural environment, in our air. There's a lot of talk about it at the EU level. Restrictions have been put in place. It's not so good in the UK. That's some of the policy work that we're doing. But unfortunately, EDCs are everywhere. And they are also in our body. Unfortunately, we found them in our bodily fluids, in our blood. And the thing with EDCs and exposure is when we get exposed is really important. So if we are exposed early in life, in the womb, or during early development, that's when danger can happen, particularly also with breast cancer risk. These are the kinds of products, everyday products that we find EDCs in. You've got these very complicated names, but they're used in parabens, so they're preservatives for, say, cosmetics. Glyphosate, a very commonly used pesticide, is a known EDC. PFAS, which is used in food packaging. If you go and buy yourself a pizza and the pizza's got a packet that's waterproof, that's PFAS. And PFAS is also known as forever chemicals, so you probably have heard of those. Triclosan, flame retardants, which are used to make flame-resistant furniture flame-resistant. Phthalates, used in perfumes. There's a lot of research done on phthalates and the impact on our reproductive system. And then we've got bisphenols used in plastic bottles. Now, I know this is all a lot of information to take in. We've got lots of resources on our website. On all of this, you can download a whole guide on EDCs, where to find them, and importantly, how to avoid them. I can talk to you a bit later as well about the really good app you can use so you can select some products. The key is to look at the ingredients and avoid products that contain them. And so quite generally speaking, I just want to reiterate that it's a range of factors that will determine whether or not we go on to develop breast cancer. We are all at risk of developing breast cancer, but we all have control over a lot of those risk factors. What's important is that you don't have to look at everything and think, gosh, I achieve everything at once. Small changes actually make a really, really big difference. So I mentioned earlier on we have a quiz, and I encourage you all to have a go at the quiz. You start by putting information about your own lifestyle, and you might find there's a few things in there that maybe you can think about changing. And every little change makes a difference to our breast cancer risk. So it's Breast Cancer Awareness Month. There's a few things you can do. If you're interested in supporting our charity, we have a challenge for Breast Cancer Awareness Month, which is so focused on physical activity. I'm doing it myself, 30-day yoga challenge, which I'm already starting to feel. The other thing is, tell your friends about this quiz, because it can make a big difference to people. Change your perspective and understanding on what breast cancer is. It's not an inevitability, and we do have control over our health, and this will help you to get that perspective. So take the quiz yourself, and then if you are interested in the work we do around EDCs, have a look into it, and we've got a pledge. It's directed at UK government, but we're hoping that we'll be able to start to work with the EU, because EU regulation system actually is a lot better than the UK. So that's it.